Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now this super cheap gaming machine cost me less than £200 to put together. It features a modern CPU, a discrete graphics card, an NVMe SSD, and there's even a decent upgrade path. Normally I'd suggest an aging pre-built as a solid starting point to any cut price computer build, but that's just not as fun. So let's give this old thing a worthy send off before seeing what's inside my custom creation. Now this build may not look the part and it won't win everyone over, but I like to think of it as a solid introduction to the world of cheap PC gaming. A lovely little icebreaker, if you will. Speaking of which, a £200 custom PC build is no simple feat. It can be quite the challenge. And what's a challenge without competition? I asked fellow content creator Iceberg Tech to come up with something on the same budget. The link to his video will be in the top line of the description. The rules were simple, no pre-builts and no peripherals or operating systems had to be included in the price. Please do head over there after seeing what I'm calling the HMS Endurance in action. Yeah, I can make all the ice-breaking jokes I like, but the truth is, I'm not that confident my build is going to be the better of the two. That said, I'm pretty happy with what I've got and I think it's a decent showcase of what can be achieved with a little bit of patience and perhaps a sprinkling of luck. But let's get into it. For some reason I was determined to build something on a modern platform even though the budget made that incredibly difficult. I ended up refreshing the newly listed computer components page on eBay and it was there I found this. This is a Socket AM4 motherboard. It was listed as a B550M Pro VDH Wi-Fi, which was probably just the result of eBay's auto listing suggestion, as I could see it was the non-Wi-Fi version from the pictures. For the price, I didn't mind at all. The description said board only, but it was a nice surprise seeing the I/O shield in the box too. At a total of $28.71, this was a bargain I couldn't resist. But now I had a problem. This board only supports 3000 and 5000 series AM4 chips, so cheaper second or first gen Ryzens were out of the question. 5000 series chips would have blown the budget, but I managed to find one of these for a total of £35. It's the 4-core, 8-thread Ryzen 3100. It was a decent budget CPU when it launched in 2020, and it's still surprisingly good, especially at this price. It can also be overclocked on a stock cooler, which we didn't get with this, but more about that later. Before moving on to the AliExpress purchases, I'll run through the rest of the eBay finds. In this day and age, I feel as though an SSD is pretty important, and if your board and budget allows for it, an NVMe drive is even better. A terabyte would have been nice, but 512 gigs was more suited to our budget, and this is plenty of space for our operating system and a few games. A power supply is the most important part of any build, and here I had to make sacrifices, but I also knew that we needed something half decent, even if it was quite old. I think it's probably better to go with something old that was good at the time rather than something new that's of poor quality. I won this 530 watt Nexus unit in an eBay auction for a total of $13.29. For the case, well, you've seen it already, but this started life as a beaten up Vigeland Genie. I got a bit happy with the spray paint, which I didn't include in the price as I had it already, and this is of course an optional cosmetic choice. At just under £2 it was a great deal, though the postage cost pushed the price up. It came with a PSU and I thought I could sell this to claw back some money, but no one wants it. So at the time of this video, it cost me the full £9.63. I would have kept it, but it didn't have the appropriate connectors for this machine. This case also came with a rear fan and USB 3 ports, though these are really only for show, as the layout of the inside of the case means we can't actually plug any USB 3 headers in. Yeah, I wish I could remove this sort of blocky hard drive bay, but it seems to be bolted to the chassis. I'll have to get some sort of metal cutter in here at a later date. Oh, I also applied this cheeky little Ryzen 9 sticker I found in the drawer. That's free performance right there. For the AliExpress finds, let's start with the RAM, which I feel I was really lucky with. I selected the 3200MHz DDR4 from the site. The listing said 16 gigs times 2. I thought I was getting two 8GB sticks for a total of 16, but instead what I got was 32GB of DDR4. The box even says 16. Now I'm not sure if this was a mistake, generosity on the part of the seller, or I just didn't interpret the listing correctly, but I can't complain. 32 gigs of DDR4 for a total of 2836 is pretty decent, while on AliExpress I got a stock AM4 cooler with thermal paste pre-applied, a backplate and a little box of screws, as nothing I had purchased so far came with any. All that I needed now was a graphics card, and because anything more powerful would blow the budget, I went with the Elsa RX 580 2048 8GB. After tax, this came to just over 50 quid. There are slightly better cards available for not much more, but even if I hadn't needed the extras like the heatsink, backplate and screws, I still wouldn't have had enough money for, say, the 5500 instead. What I didn't think about was whether or not this would actually fit in our cheap and cheerful case, but luckily, or should I say with a slight bit of force, I managed to squeeze it in. And I mean really squeeze it in. In total then, I had spent just less than £200 for something that should be somewhat capable now, as well as upgradable. I wouldn't necessarily keep the PSU and case, but the core components, like the CPU, RAM and motherboard, could easily be transferred to another enclosure at a later date if you wanted to. As a side note, there is a link in the description to a screenshot of all the orders placed for this video, so check that out if you want to see the prices for yourselves. So what can this beast do? Let's find out. The first thing I did was overclock the CPU to 4.2 GHz. No special equipment was needed here, as it's possible on the stock cooler, simply by setting the clock multiplier to 42 in the BIOS. It'll help in CPU intensive tasks, but ultimately our GPU is the limitation, and overclocking that in our small enclosure wasn't a good idea for the sake of temperatures. Obviously at this price point some games are off the table. I didn't even need to hit the benchmark key to tell you how bad Alan Wake 2 ran, and when it came to Starfield, well, it'll hit 30 FPS with some heavily reduced settings, and thanks to our SSD the plethora of loading screens aren't all that off-putting, but overall it's a bit of a struggle for this thing. Not all AAA games run badly though, far from it, especially with a bit of help from FSR. Spider-Man at medium hit at least 60 FPS and the percentile lows were pretty solid. Swinging through New York City was a pleasure, even with this CPU, which I was sure would cause more issues than this. Even if you were to tell me this motherboard does support first and second gen AM4 CPUs, I'm not really that concerned because it's our graphics card that is the primary limitation here. The next gen version of The Witcher 3 also ran well at medium, this time with no help from FSR. The busy streets didn't do too much to upset our percentile performance with decent 1 and 0.1% lows yet again. I'm not entirely sure the temperature reading for the processor is accurate. It could just be that the limitation our graphics card is imposing means that the Ryzen 3 isn't actually doing that much work. GTA 5, as you might expect, pose no threat to our 4-core 8-thread 3100 or the RX 580. With the high settings we saw over 100 FPS with percentile lows that also sat well above 60. We could have cranked up the resolution or perhaps a few of the settings, but that is all down to personal preference. I also tested Cyberpunk at low with FSR and we'll be looking at this again as part of the head-to-head benchmarks in a minute, but for now, and with these visual options, 60 FPS was achievable, even though we did experience a few drops here and there, especially in busier parts of the city. Where this build is at its best is with online competitive games. CS2 will run at over 120 FPS, and even at the low settings I think it looks pretty good, not that visuals are all that important here. The same can be said for Fortnite, which with the low settings will also achieve over 120 FPS. We could turn things up for sure, but this looks fine, and the more frames the better. I was using DX12 mode with 100% res scale, but for those wanting to squeeze even more frames from this game, then there is a performance mode which lowers the visuals further. The finals was the most demanding of all the online FPS titles. This one required FSR in my opinion and the low settings, but it was definitely playable and the performance numbers remained fairly consistent. The next set of results are the challenge benchmarks, the results that will be used to compare the performance of this PC to the one built by Iceberg. I was going to run comparative results on screen and borrow some footage from his video, but I recommend opening another tab and seeing for yourself how things stack up side by side. I'm not just saying that because I think I've lost and I don't want to run winning comparisons in my video, I swear. For Red Dead Redemption 2 we are using the Digital Foundry console equivalent settings at 1080p. Running the in-game benchmark gets us exactly 60 frames per second with a minimum of 47. not too bad. Forza Horizon 5 probably could have benefited from a lower preset, but to be honest, outside of the more demanding benchmark run, it is more common to see at least 60 FPS. That said, this segment was quite challenging for our graphics card, which didn't quite make it past this 60 FPS barrier at these visual quality settings. It's a good effort nonetheless. Finally, we're back in Cyberpunk, which is best played at low with FSR, but without it, this 60 FPS target is just out of reach. Still, for the money spent, I can't complain, and I think it's a good effort for both components. The PSU hasn't blown up either, so what more could we ask for, right? To finalise, we have the Time Spy and Cinebench numbers. The single core result for the 3100 is still pretty impressive in my opinion, and I'd like to revisit it at some point with a more powerful GPU. But there we have it. £200 isn't a lot when it comes to a PC build, and there are definitely simpler ways to go about it, but where's the fun in that? Be sure to check out Iceberg Tech's video and his other content as well. I will leave a link in the description. All that's left to say is thank you for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.